Listeners, we're still on our summer break during this hot and beautiful month of July. But don't fret, we're dropping episodes every Tuesday that we're gone. Today's episode comes from Gender War Games, the podcast from Kristen Conger and Unladylike Media. Hannah and I had Kristen on our show, Material Girls, for the episode Avril Lavigne's clone Melissa by Social Surveillance. In that episode, we talked about the silliness and the issues with conspiracy theories and the way they spread. If you haven't listened to that episode, I really recommend it. But for now, get ready for a conversation about how white womanhood is activated politically, culturally, algorithmically to reinforce systems of power. From trad wife aesthetics to turf rhetoric, strategic essentialism to state violence, we aim to make sense of how white femininity gets mobilized. Kristen is brilliant, and we think you'll absolutely love this episode and her work, if you aren't already familiar with it. Well, that's it for now. Enjoy the episode.
A 30-country survey from Ipsos and King's College of London that came out in March 2025 found that 68% of people say gender equality matters to them personally. The majority thinks efforts to advance it are a positive. And also get this, more Gen Z women identify as feminists than any generation before. And yet, of course, we're in the midst of a gender war, allegedly. There is certainly an attack on gender itself and gender nonconformity. And yes, there are a lot of Gen Z men and millennial women, I will say, based off of this Ipsos poll, who think that feminism just went too far. But guess what else that 30-country survey found? The biggest tension that all of us feel, the biggest societal tension, it's not between men and women. That was actually towards the bottom of the list. The most widely felt division right now around the world is between the rich and the rest of us. That has really stuck with me. Yet another bait and switch of, wait, we are talking so much about gender war, but, oh, hang on, billionaires, broligarchy, corruption, crypto. We're all getting fucked, regardless of our gender. And the thing about gender war, you know, the polarization between presumably cishet men and women that it's referring to, that is real. But when we consider the conditions that stoked it, online echo chambers, the influencer economy, unregulated platforms, a pandemic, chronic loneliness, financial instability, gender war really sounds like a misdirect. Today's guests, Marcelle Cosman and Hannah McGregor, are hosts of the podcast Material Girls, where they take their academic expertise and go deep on the zeitgeist. We're talking strategic essentialism, the myth of shared womanhood, gender as a state apparatus, and white women as both enforcers and escape hatches of patriarchy.
When we say, are we at gender war? Who's the we, and who are the sides involved in the war? Is maybe this is what I want to know, because it's a complex question for sure, right? That's why we're starting with it. My name is Marcelle Cosman. I am one of the two hosts of Material Girls. I'm also an instructor at the University of Alberta. That's in Canada for most of your listeners.
I'm Hannah McGregor. I'm the other half of Material Girls, and I am a associate professor of publishing studies at Simon Fraser University, which is in Vancouver, the Canada one as well. I was thinking about laying the ground for what is the terrain on which the war is being waged, essentially. And this, when I was sort of percolating a bit on this conversation yesterday, And I was like, oh, do we need to talk about Spivak and strategic essentialism? Like, is that a useful place to enter? Which maybe it is. And maybe people who haven't spent their whole life studying feminist theory are not familiar with Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's concept of strategic gender essentialism, where basically she makes the argument that the category of woman is totally, like, meaningfully different across different cultures. That we can't treat it as a stable category that exists in exactly the same way from culture to culture across history. Because womanness is inflected by all kinds of other characteristics of cultures. And she's not just she is talking about race, certainly, but she's talking also about ethnicity and religion and class and you know, lots of the complexities of culture. And she's like, so there's nothing that is actually essentially shared by a category called women. That's a made up category. And then she says, but for the purposes of political work, it might be effective for us to pretend there's such a thing as women. And this is in part where the concept of women of color emerges, right? That is a strategically developed collective identity that encompasses a lot of difference within it and was always meant for the feminist theorists who originally came up with these ideas. It was always meant to sort of be in scare quotes, right? It was always meant to be like, we know that this is a made up category, but we think it might have some use to us, right? So as soon as we start talking about, like, are we at gender war? It's like, cool, who, which gender, where, how?
And part of why this question has been on my mind for a while is in reaction to a lot of headlines and analysis and data, especially churning around in 2024, because it was an election year in the United States and a lot of other places. And this narrative that in the US, like both Republicans and Democrats like ran on of like, this is a boys versus girls election, which as soon as I started seeing that narrative, and then it escalated to gender war, America's gender war, we are at gender war. And I don't know, like I was cynical of just that top line because A, just like the hyperbole of it all, B, like don't push me into war.
I refuse to be conscripted into the gender wars.
Right. And really the underlying question, like the biggest question of like, wait, but who are we talking about? This is big, broad brush stuff. And it seems like the gender war in a lot of these pieces was just a different way to say a political gender gap of women voting more democratically, men leaning more Republican, which is not new. So to me, like based on what I have read and the data that I've seen, it's like, don't call it a gender war. It's a cis het meltdown. Right?
Oh, it's so interesting that it's being called a gender war. And I think you're right. I think there is in sort of Western capitalist culture a gender crisis, like a acute concentration of anxieties circulating around gender. You know, calling that a war is sort of journalistic flair predominantly, I suspect. But I do agree with the basic premise that people are freaking the fuck out about gender right now.
I think that there's a real panic about gender being unstable. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about scapegoating, actually, because we haven't talked about that yet. And I feel like being able to name the targeting of trans people and targeting gender fluidity as a threat or as a problem is literally scapegoating, right? It's literally a way of taking the small population of people and making them responsible for a wide array of things that they have nothing to do with. And so I wonder if, I don't know, for me, having the language to describe what I see going on is always like a really core first step. And so like on an individual level or on a community level, being able to actively name like this, what's happening here, that is scapegoating. That's fucked up and that's wrong. Let's unpack it. I think solid first step for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I've been talking about this a lot with a lot of my, queer and includes a lot of trans people community, like my queer and trans community. Yeah, you know what I mean. My community of friends who are feminists and queer and trans. And we have been talking a lot about like, what is it about trans people who are such a tiny percentage of the population, that they have been, I mean, trans people have done nothing to invite
to be clear,
to invite this level of vilification. But why is it that it has proven effective as a talking point for the right? And I hear a lot of people talk about like, well, one of the things is it's easy to it's easier to vilify a community that's so small that a lot of people don't know any trans people or don't know if they know any trans people. So that's part of it. But I also think that gender is such a core technology at the basis of both white supremacy and capitalism that when those systems feel under threat, doubling down on gender as a technology of population management has proven to be effective.
Kristen, do you think it'd be worth us unpacking that idea? Because I feel like that's a real, if you have listeners who have like never thought of gender as a technology or as like I don't know, what do you think? Should we dig into that?
No, I love this, and I am new to this like concept of gender as a technology. So please tell me everything.
Yeah, I mean it in a very similar way to ideological state apparatus, which is to say that late capitalist white supremacist states, in which I would include the US and Canada and probably most of Europe. I don't know the history and politics of Europe as well, but I'm going to go ahead and throw them in there. One of the ways that power has operated historically in these states is that people in a position of power use categories of identity as a way to manage the population, right? So you can think about, and this is where Althusser is useful. Like, this is Louis Althusser, but we call him Althusser in English because we love to put an R on the end of a name. He basically is like, the state has like obvious ways to like force you to do what they want you to do, right? Like the police and the military, but they also have all of these other ways to like manage and control the population that are like put in place ideally so that you end up self-managing, so that you end up like really identifying with a set of categories, and you self-discipline, right? So like notions of citizenship and like national identity and the way that you ought to behave if you are a member of a certain in-group, that becomes a way, for example, of like the state disciplining you so that you self-manage. And that might be, in the case of Canada, we might think about, this current moment that we've got a like real surge in Canadian nationalism because of the threat of being taken over by the states. And nationalism as a sentiment, among other things, is a way of disciplining a population away from critique of their own government and what their own government is up to, right? So it's like a way of sort of encouraging you to identify with a particular group and then to recognize appropriate ways to behave when you are part of that group so that you manage yourself and the state doesn't need to like put you in a prison.
Okay. So Hannah, I need you to talk to me a little bit about how and why gender is a technology that maintains the status quo for capitalism. Let's just say capitalism.
Yeah, so how does gender maintain the status quo for capitalism? Think about things like if your country cannot provide enough living wage jobs for everybody in the country because your economy is built on an apparatus that wants to exploit the labor of the majority for the wealth of a very, very small minority.
Yeah.
Capitalism. Then one useful thing you can do is convince 50% of the population that it is natural for them to probably not want to have careers.
Oh, okay.
And it's useful actually to start doing that as early as possible. So if you could start right from the get-go convincing that 50% of the population that they are natural caretakers, that they're more comfortable in the domestic realm, that having children is a definitional part of their whole identity, their purpose on earth, that inevitably they are going to take on the majority of the labor in the domestic realm, the majority of the sort of... Yeah. And all of that labor, it doesn't have to be paid for because it's natural, right? That's not labor. You take all of that work of social reproduction, as the Marxists call it, and you say, this isn't real labor, actually. None of this counts. So nobody has to get paid for that. And if that's very useful for capitalism. 50% of the work in the world is happening in a way that nobody has to be paid for because it's been excluded from the category of labor, and it's like vital for anything to operate, but it doesn't count as work. And it is naturally, spontaneously desired by a category of people on the basis of whether or not you have a uterus. What a really useful sort of way of saying, okay, the biological presence of organs that would allow you to produce another human, whether or not those are actually working, if you're not fertile, that's a personal moral failure and you really should work on that. But the presence of those organs means that you are a woman, and being a woman means a whole bunch of things. And those things, right, those things that being a woman mean are the technology of gender. Right. And so they start operating on us really, really early through gender divided children's clothes and toys and television and like in all of these really material ways. And one of the functions of that set of technologies is to get us to identify very strongly with this category and with the innate qualities of this category. And those qualities include things like unpaid labor, management of the household, emotional labor, physical reproduction, etc.
Sexual availability.
Sexual availability. Because if your main function is reproduction, then probably anybody who wants should be allowed to put their dick in you. And you absolutely cannot have access to abortions.
Not.
You know, and the flip side of this is there has been a lot of discourse about masculinity in crisis. And I will say, masculinity is inherently a crisis. Like, by definition, masculinity is just, like, designed to be a crisis for all kinds of reasons. One thing that's really stuck out to me is, like, in one of these, like, books or articles or think pieces, somebody said that guaranteed, like, universal basic income is an attack on masculinity. Because what would it mean to be a man if it wasn't to work hard and provide for your family? Right? And if you can hear that and you don't hear that contemporary masculinity is a trap created by capitalism, then listen to it again. Listen to it several more times and really think, like, who's gaining from that logic that says that you're not a man unless you are successful under the logics of capital. Like, why would those have anything to do with each other? Unless one was a very useful fiction that capitalism exploited in order to convince, again, the other 50% of the population, like, that what defines them is lack of access to emotion, capacity for violence, ownership of women, crushing amounts of labor. Like, that also sucks.
Yeah.
It's just, it sucks in a way that means that they get most of the money and enact most of the violence. But it still sucks. It's a basic premise of feminism, is that, like, there's, like, these models of gender are, like, they're not working for anybody. They're really quite bad.
Part of my wary eye on the gender war narrative is, not to sound conspiratorial, but, like, how much of this is also just a really shitty, like, economic framework telling people with uteruses that we need to have more babies, especially if those uteruses are inside of like white people.
Yeah,
for sure. So, like, capitalism and white supremacy are indivisible. They come from the same place, and they have operated together through, you know, imperialism, globalization, extraction, right? Like, the function of white supremacy to define a portion of the world as less human and thus able to be exploited in the interest of the accumulation of capital, like, shows us how, like, those systems work hand in hand. This is, like, what a lot of theorists refer to as racial capitalism, is, like, you need to understand that, like, these two things are deeply enmeshed. So when we talk about, like, why it is a useful technology of the state to be like, half of you, your job is to reproduce, we also have to inflect that with an understanding not only of how it's enmeshed with capitalism, but also how it's enmeshed with white supremacy and with race as another technology of the state. And a lot of the discourse around the gender wars is tied up in the white supremacist Great Replacement conspiracy, which is the idea that white people are being replaced by people of color, which, like, in order to believe that, you have to believe a whole bunch of pretty wild things about, like, the essential nature of racial identity, and that is a threat to whiteness, and that it is thus the job of white women to be producing more white children for the white state. And that expectation of reproduction for the sake of the state has also been tied in by a number of people to anti-trans sentiment. That, like, if you need white people to be reproducing for the state, then transness any kind of gender fluidity, any kind of rejection of the sex gender binary is a threat to that project.
But
right?
before we talk in detail about that, which I think we have to talk about the way that transness is being positioned as a threat to population management or population control.
Yeah, I think population management.
But we can't forget that there is no shortage of people in the world, right? Like the global population.
100%. Anybody freaking out about like population growth, about being like, well, our population's not growing fast enough. It's like, hey, borders are made up and there's a ton of humans. So not
only do we have tons of people, we also very specifically have tons of people who want to relocate to these areas that are seeing a decline in population, right? And so the anxiety about white people needing to have more babies is also coming at the same time that we're seeing both Canada and the US, can't speak to Europe, I don't know, but both Canada and the US cutting immigration numbers severely.
In Europe is huge.
So all of these things are so clearly tied in together. Okay, I needed to say that out loud in case any listeners are like, but wait a second.
Yes.
Because you're right. You're right.
And I think that it's like part of the circles I've been running around in my mind, RE, gender war, and like what is actually happening here is the fact that the narrative, which is specific to cis straight people, what we've been talking about, more of a classic battle of the sexes style dynamic, if we want to get super binary. And what keeps tripping me up is like, okay, I see that dynamic over there, but how can we call it a gender war when there's been a specific subset of, I'll go ahead and say like cis white women who have done everything in their power to weaponize gender against gender diverse and trans people. Like, how is there a gender war within a gender war? Is it all a war on gender? And then I pause and I say to myself, Kristen, you got to step away for a second.
Kristen, you're in too deep.
Like, how is it possible to talk about both at the same time? Because I think it is essential to talk about both at the same time.
Yeah. You absolutely need to talk about both at the same time. And, you know, my best understanding of the like trans exclusionary feminist movement, which is notably dominated by middle-class white women, is that it is rooted in an understanding that, you know, comes out of a particular line of feminism, that women's power, our ability to have any political power, comes from a sort of over-identification with our biology. That, like, the source, if you go back to, like, you know, gender as a basic technology of white supremacy and capitalism, then within that framework, the power that women have had access to has had to do with things like reproduction, right? So, like, your very identity, your visibility as a political subject, your you know, ability to move the needle on political issues, right? Like, it's mothers marching on things, you know, like women's political agency has been so entwined with motherhood, for example, that I think for some women, any challenge to the idea that their identity is grounded in biological fact feels like a fundamental attack on any kind of foothold in power, in political power, that women have managed to gain over the past, 150 years. That it's like, well, if we don't have this, like biological truth about who we are, then all of our progress will have been for nothing. I think that's the anxiety. And it's a like an over identification with gender identity, because at some point you have come to believe that actually it's the key to your liberation. To which I say, it's not.
I mean, if we look at, I know there are legitimate criticisms about thinking of feminism in terms of waves. It is nevertheless a useful way to think about the different periods of feminism. So, with that caveat, if we think about what we call the period of first wave feminism, it was the suffragettes. It was almost exclusively white women disavowing their relationship to Black and brown women in order to argue for their value to the state. We deserve to have the right to vote because we are the mothers of the nation. We have, because
we are the white mothers of the white nation.
Because we have this inherent, innate, natural ability to care for and raise the nation. We are people and therefore deserve the right to vote.
Yeah. Which is why it's not a coincidence that so many of those first wave white feminists were also active supporters of eugenics, including forced sterilization of women of color, because they understood their role as white women to be managing the population.
So much of the history of white feminism, or feminism among white women, is it has this long trajectory of white women dissociating ourselves from women of color for the purposes of managing and controlling people of color in general. So it shouldn't be super surprising that this history of biological essentialism is also entangled in anxiety about controlling the population, and in particular about preserving the so-called white race, right? That all of these things function in tandem. And if women of color are not the enemy to white feminism, someone else is going to be. And currently, it seems, because racism isn't very politically tolerable out loud. I'm not saying racism doesn't exist. It absolutely does. But it is no longer politically tolerable to dehumanize people of color in the way that it would have been 100 years ago. But it absolutely is politically tolerable to dehumanize trans and gender diverse people. It is absolutely politically tolerable to pit this very small population as a threat to society, as a threat to the family, as a threat to the future of the nation.
The nation, right? Like, because the nation relies on these stable categories in order to keep operating the way that it operates. And also, there is a way in which the rejection of the sex gender binary does pose a threat to white supremacy and late capitalism and patriarchy, because it undermines some of the like inherent logics that propel those systems. And that's a distinction, right? Like, I think a distinction that sounds so, like academic and unnecessary, but distinguishing between like actual trans people are not a threat, leave them alone, and gender fluidity destabilizing the gender binary does threaten a lot of the oppressive state apparatuses of states like the US and Canada, and that it's not a coincidence, I think, that they have been drawn in as the sort of boogeyman of the gender wars.
white feminism, even white feminism, I think, would not agree with the patriarchal sexist idea that more rights for women means less rights for men. Kind of like that zero-sum
Totally.
framing.
We would hope.
We would hope. And yet, that feels like the exact kind of framing that a lot of these women, and I am talking specifically about women. I know it's not all just women, but that these women are taking towards transness and trans women and the existence of trans women and girls as somehow diminishing the category
Right.
of woman and their own, like the validity of their own womanhood and whatever kind of collective power and influence that brings them.
One thing that it makes me think about is how much work various feminist movements have had to do in order to push back against the basic premise that rights for women will come at the direct expense of rights for men. Like, one of the major talking points against women's suffrage was that women were likely to vote more liberally than their husbands, and that they would thus cancel out their husbands' votes, and thus that women's suffrage would like undermine the premise of democracy. So like right from the get-go, we've got this anxiety that if women can do things, it means that men can't do things. And I think part of why most feminists understand that's not the case is that contemporary understandings of feminism are interested in gender in general as a system that has like oppressive gender norms having like a negative impact on everybody. But I also think it's been like a little bit of a PR campaign for women's rights. Right? Is to really drive home the like, you can give us rights and you won't lose anything. We swear you won't lose a single thing. You don't have to give up anything at all. Because any time that there is a movement that's like, we would like a right and you actually have to give something up for us to have it, the pushback against that movement is violent. So any kind of political power that says, like, or any kind of political movement that says, like, it's not actually going to look like us all becoming rich white men. That's not what collective liberation's going to look like. Actually, nobody gets to be a billionaire. Nobody gets to enact violence against other people with impunity. It's just the idea is actually that nobody's doing that anymore. And if that identity or the possibility of access to that identity has been really crucial to your like understanding of the world, then any sort of social rearrangement that says like, yeah, actually there's room, like everybody, we could just give everybody income. We could let anybody who wants to immigrate. All of this is totally possible. It just means nobody gets to be a billionaire. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. But what if I was going to be a billionaire maybe? It's like, you weren't. So calm
What
down.
about my crypto investments?
Yeah, sorry. If your dad wasn't already a billionaire, you're not going to be a billionaire. Sorry, that's not how being a billionaire works. You're not going to stumble into it. If you're going to be that rich, you're already that rich. But like, that's always a challenge, right? And so there's very frequently this sort of strategic political move of trying to convince people that like, actually, you won't give anything up. I promise. Just give us a few rights. You won't lose anything. And it's like, I don't know, like maybe, yeah, some things actually maybe you lose. Some things maybe you need to lose.
A third thing, if we think of it as a triangle, that I think people don't want to be excluded, right? And so there's this real sense of like, well, if my experience tells me otherwise, then you're telling me that I don't belong, or that I'm not welcome, or that my perspective is unwelcome. And remember, like I was saying earlier about that individualistic impulse of like, well, well, yes, I am a person and I have experience, but I'm also part of this broader system. And I think finding ways to focus on community and inclusion throughout that process of recognizing experience, recognizing like what a person brings to the community as a person or as an individual, but without that sense of isolation, is so key to being able to then disentangle the complexity. And it is scary and it is super complicated, because in the moment, it's not like a cool thought experiment. In the moment, it's like this group of people is telling me that my experience is wrong. And that sucks. Being in that position sucks. And so then maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's the group of people needing to like find language that isn't like, no, what you're saying is wrong. And maybe it's also like remembering that we can't universalize our individual experiences, I think is what I'm trying to say.
There are ways that community, that really sitting in the messiness and the complexity and the ongoing work of community making is one of the really necessary skill sets that we all, I think, need to be building right now. And that's like, you know, when you are somebody who's really deeply invested in community building, you know that it involves a lot of really hard stuff, like a lot of messiness and complexity and hurt feelings and navigating relationships across differences of race and, you know, access to financial resources and ability and like all of these things, right? Like the actual business of getting down and figuring out how to be in community with people whose lives look really different from yours or look similar in a lot of ways, but in some really core ways are different. I think is like, that is a way to build the muscle that lets us move out of hyper individuality and away from fear of complexity, and lets us move into comfort with the messiness of like being with each other. There's a lot of what passes for discourse just being like, I'm going to undermine your insistence that the world could be better by pointing out that it would be hard for that to happen. And it's like, yeah, dog, I know. I know it will be hard. And I actually don't know how we'll get there. And I actually don't know how we fix a lot of the problems. But the fact that I don't know how to fix it doesn't mean that it's not broken.
Yeah.
Through gender war games, I really was hoping to come up with a grand solution to all of this, a tidy explanation, and maybe jokes on me for calling it gender war games, because the thing about war games is they're all a simulation, right? And if you've ever watched one of my favorite childhood films, War Games, starring Matthew Broderick pre-Ferris Bueller, and my very first celebrity doppelganger, Ali Sheedy, pre-Breakfast Club, you know that the war game simulations, they're also dangerous. What was I talking about? Marcel and Hannah are right, though. This is a time of mass uncertainty. It's scary, and doing anything differently, large or small, is a challenge, let's be honest. And there are still so many layers of gender war games that I did not even touch. So if you would like to hear more of these conversations, well, the first thing you can do is head over to the Patreon. That is where you can hear full ad-free interviews with Hannah and Marcel. It is a nearly 2-hour interview, I will say. You can hear that and all of the interviews, uncut interviews with our Feminination guests, and get access to nearly 200 other ad-free bonus episodes. Thank you so much to Marcel Cosman and Hannah McGregor. Go listen to Material Girls. I was on the show not that long ago talking about the Avril Lavigne doppelganger conspiracy theory. So random, I know, but I also host another show called Conspiracy, She Wrote, where I take a similar kind of gender feminist obsessive look at our conspiracy culture. And Avril Lavigne, she's just if you just want a fun mental getaway, but still genius theory coming from Hannah and Marcel, you gotta go listen to that episode. You can find me on Instagram at unladylikemedia. I would love to hear from you. You can also go to unladylike.substack.com and subscribe to the newsletter where I write about women and gender and share related news worth reading. Thank you so much for coming along the Feminination journey with me. I hope it's been enlightening. I hope it's been cathartic, and I hope I'll see you again soon.
We'll be back next week with another drop-in episode. If you're missing us, hey, we miss you too. And also, you can always head to patreon.com/ohwitchplease to become a supporter of the show. There, you'll get so many ad-free bonus episodes, you will, frankly, stop missing us completely. It costs as little as $5 US a month to support the show, but it is the difference between us paying Coach or not. Don't you want us to pay Coach? Don't you want Coach to get some money? Don't you want to listen to more episodes? I know you do. Again, head to patreon.com/ohwitchplease or wait until next week for another July drop-in. Until then, later, gender traitors.